About 2 days ago, rumors started to swirl that George Lucas was going to be returning to Star Wars to write 2 episodes for the new Andor show. This reminds me of about 6 months ago, where a few people were insisting to me that George Lucas had written episodes for The Mandalorian. George Lucas had nothing to do with The Mandalorian, he's not involved with Andor, and furthermore, he has nothing to do with anything Disney Star Wars. Unfortunately, most people go with a headline and don't do the research. Let's take a look. Everyone cites Imdb as their quote-unquote proof that George Lucas is involved with Disney Star Wars. Here we are on the Andor page, 2022. As you can see here, writers, George Lucas, Tony Gilroy, Stephen Schiff. If I click here on this link, it will take me to George Lucas's page, which we will get back to shortly. First, I want you to see, down here at the bottom, anyone can edit this page. I can very simply come down to writers, or any of the cast and crew of any of the shows on IMDb. Here I can correct or delete, or I can add a credit. The first thing you will notice is the only official writer is Stephen Schiff. You don't even have the other writers here, including George Lucas. Now I could correct it, delete it. I could also add a new credit. So I could add Joe Blow. Joe Blow, episode 1.1. I could add attributes or an order if there was more episodes. Now, if it's a known name, like George Lucas, I can simply choose George Lucas. See here? Episode 1.1. Recheck. So here, I can submit this update. IMDb does check. Sometimes edits and submissions slip through, sometimes they can reject them, and as I said, someone from Lucasfilm could add a name. Naturally, IMDb is going to trust that if someone submits that George Lucas is writing for a Star Wars show, they're going to assume that that is legitimate. IMDb is not actually calling up Lucasfilm or George Lucas to confirm this. If I were to put Frankenstein, they're obviously not going to approve the submission. But if you submit a name that is synonymous with Star Wars, like Lawrence Kasdan, then IMDb is going to accept that submission. The point here is that any one of you can come into IMDb and edit or add, of all people, George Lucas to a Star Wars project. So let's go back a little bit and let's look at The Mandalorian, because there were people claiming that George Lucas wrote episodes for The Mandalorian. As you can see here, George Lucas, because someone submitted George Lucas's name. That is not an official confirmation from Lucasfilm. Writers, Favreau, see more. Here are the directors of each episode, and here are the writers for each episode. Now look closely. Jon Favreau, Rick, Dave, Yost, and you see here these 2 submissions for George Lucas. And what does it say? Based on Star Wars by George Lucas. Based on Star Wars by George Lucas. They're not saying that he actually wrote the episodes, but rather that the show is based on Star Wars, created by George Lucas. Star Wars: The Clone Wars, Season 7, Episode 1, The Bad Batch. We all know George Lucas had nothing to do with Season 7. He sold the franchise back in 2012. Created by George Lucas. The Mandalorian, Season 1, Episode 1, Chapter 1, The Mandalorian. Written by Jon Favreau. If you look at every episode, written by Jon Favreau. Based on Star Wars by George Lucas. This does not mean that George Lucas is involved in The Mandalorian. It means that the show is based on Star Wars by George Lucas. The Mandalorian, Season 2, Episode 8, Chapter 16, The Rescue. So from the first episode of The Mandalorian to the last, most recent episode of The Mandalorian, written by Jon Favreau. Created by Jon Favreau. Based on Star Wars by George Lucas. Once again, George Lucas has nothing to do with The Mandalorian. The story, all of the Star Wars universe, is based on George Lucas's Star Wars. That is what this is telling you. George Lucas was never, ever involved with The Mandalorian. We now come back to Andor. Writers, George Lucas. As you can see, there's no information here yet for Andor. But if we go to George Lucas, here he is, the maker, and you scroll down to his filmography, you'll first notice that there are all kinds of Exile, Kara, Old Republic, Legends, Star Wars, World War II, The Lesser Evil, all these fan films that have a credit of George Lucas. Not because George Lucas is involved in them, but because they are giving a credit for the characters, for using themes based on George Lucas's Star Wars. Not because George Lucas is involved in it. Star Wars Hoshino, The Arkham Escapers, Rogue One, a Star Wars toy story, The Distant Echo, a Star Wars story, Laser Brain, Sons of the Force. These are all fan films, and they all give a credit to George Lucas, not because he is involved, but because it is based on his characters and or the Star Wars universe. So now we'll come down to his TV credits. Ahsoka. Oh really? He's on Ahsoka? George Lucas insisted that Ahsoka dies before Order 66. Dave Filoni keeps her alive, but we're supposed to believe that George Lucas is going to be writing for Ahsoka. Sure. The Rangers of the New Republic, they just fired Gina Carano, and that show might not even happen. But we're supposed to believe that George Lucas is writing 2 episodes. Sure. Obi-Wan Kenobi. We know that George Lucas is not involved in that. That is Deborah Chow that is involved with the Obi-Wan Kenobi show. Furthermore, based on characters created by, based on characters created by, based on characters created by. It doesn't mean that George Lucas is involved in any of these shows. It means that these shows are based off of George Lucas's universe. Here, Andor, the 2 credits that everyone was saying, oh, he's writing 2 episodes for the Andor show. No, he is not. Based on his characters. Bad Batch, characters. And here you have again The Mandalorian, based on Star Wars, based on Star Wars, based on Star Wars by George Lucas. As you can see here, all 16 episodes of The Mandalorian, Season 1 and 2, 1 through 16, based on Star Wars by who? George Lucas. Book of Boba Fett, based on characters created by who? Lego Star Wars Holiday Special. Was George Lucas involved in that? No, obviously not. Based on Star Wars created by who? Star Wars, The Clone Wars. Created by, not written by. Created by George Lucas. This simply means, same thing with the Resistance, based on Star Wars created by George Lucas. Rebels, based on Star Wars created by George Lucas. We all know that's Dave Filoni. Freemaker, based on Star Wars created by George Lucas. So as you can see very clearly, George Lucas is not doing anything with the Andor show. They are simply crediting George Lucas for the Andor show being based on his characters of Cassian Andor and, in general, the Star Wars universe. And I will put this baby to bed having you use common sense. George Lucas sold Star Wars in 2012 to Disney. He was going to be a consultant, and they were going to use his sequel trilogy treatments. Within the first 2 years, Disney turned the EU into Legends, threw out his sequel trilogy treatment, and stopped having him consult. They went off and completely made their own films. They have destroyed Luke Skywalker and crapped all over the Star Wars franchise from the moment that they got it. In every way, they have retconned and broken canon. The comics, Clone Wars cartoon, Rebels, Resistance, Mandalorian, the Lego Holiday Special, all of it craps on George Lucas's Star Wars. And you really believe that George Lucas is going to come back and write for the Andor show, of all things, where they will just come behind him and crap all over that and change his stuff. The only way that George Lucas would get involved with Star Wars is if he had full control. The only way that he's going to get full control is if he owns the property. Obviously, he cannot trust Disney, as they will just go behind him and change anything that he did anyways. So ask yourself, using common sense, do you really think that George Lucas is going to write for the Andor show? No. He's only getting credited for his characters that are based on characters created by George Lucas. Please like, subscribe, and comment on the video. May the Force be with you.
Impressive.